Hey everybody, this video is called Sabbatical and Jubilee Years, and tonight we're going to continue our pass-through study here in the book of Leviticus, chapter 25, where we're going to look at the special Sabbaths in the year of Jubilee. So let's look at verses 1 and 2 starting out. In Leviticus 25 it says, "And the Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, and say to them, When you come into the land which I give you, then the Lord shall keep a Sabbath to the Lord." So this section, it goes over the proper care for the Lord's property for the sabbatical year. In verse 3 through 7, 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather its fruit. But in the 7th year there shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land, a Sabbath to the Lord. You shall neither sow your field nor prune your vineyard. What grows of its own accord of your harvest you shall not reap, nor gather the grapes of your untended vine, for it is a year of rest for the land, and the Sabbath produce of the land shall be food for you, your male and your female servants, your hired man, and the stranger who dwells with you. For your livestock and the beasts that are in your land, all its produce shall be for food. So these verses, in verses 3 through 7, it tells how to give land its Sabbath. And the Sabbath year showed a dependence on God, that you had to depend on God as you weren't working in that 7th year. And giving the land a rest every 7 years was not just great for people that like time off, but it was great for the ecology, as it would help restore vital nutrients in the soil that normally would be depleted with that much growth. And people that do farming, I remember my grandparents when they grew veggies and all that in their backyard year after year, they would do like cow manure or whatever to fertilize the soil. So this year of a break was good for the soil to rebuild. In verse 8 through 12, "And you shall count 7 Sabbaths of years for yourself, 7 years 7 times, and the time of the 7 Sabbaths of years shall be to you 49 years. Then you shall cause the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month. On the day of atonement you shall make the trumpet to sound throughout all your land. And you shall consecrate the 50th day, and proclaim liberty throughout all the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you, and each of you shall return to his possession, and each of you shall return to his family. The 50th year shall be a jubilee to you. In it you shall neither sow nor reap what grows on its own accord, nor gather the grapes of your untended vine. For it is the Jubilee, it shall be holy to you. You shall eat its produce from the field." So these are general instructions in verses 8 through 12 given for Jubilee. In Jubilee, it means ram's horn, which was blown on the 10th day of the 7th month to start the 50th year of universal redemption. And not only must they let the land lie fallow, but the people were allowed a 1-year break from their labor. And wouldn't it be nice to get a year vacation where you don't have to work for 1 whole year? But those bound by work contract were released from their commitments during the year of Jubilee, and there was a release of the obligated servants. And many take the prophecy of Isaiah chapter 61 verses 1 through 3 to speak on the Jubilee year. And our founding fathers were aware of the principle of the year of Jubilee and the freedom that was associated with it as they proclaimed liberty throughout the land. And it's inscribed within the Liberty Bell out in, I believe it's Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And it hangs in front of the Independence Hall there. In verse 13 through 17, "In this year of Jubilee, each of you shall return to his possession, And if you sell anything to your neighbor or buy from your neighbor's hand, you shall not oppress one another. According to the number of years after the Jubilee, you shall buy from your neighbor, and according to the number of years of crops he shall sell to you. According to the multitude of years you shall increase its price, and according to the fewer number of years you shall diminish its price. For he sells to you according to the number of the years of the crops. Therefore you shall not oppress one another, but you shall fear your God, for I am the Lord your God. So land was allotted according to the tribes and the families when Israel came into the promised land, and land could only be leased based off how many years were left until the Jubilee. And this assured that no family would be permanently prevented from having land. And every 50 years, every family would have the opportunity to start again. And the Jubilee year had an effect on the value of land, which was to be considered in all transactions. And no one should take these verses or take advantage or abuse another person, because cruelty is against the very character of God. And penalties for crime was to be fast and exact. And this was not a socialist system, but it was only land that was redistributed. It wasn't people's monetary income. People weren't taxed 80%, any of that. So it was only the land that was reallotted that went around. In verse 18 through 22 says, So you shall observe my statutes and keep my judgments and perform them, and you will dwell in the land in safety. Then the land will yield its fruit, and you will eat your fill and dwell there in safety. And if you say, What shall we eat in the 7th year, since we shall not sow nor gather in our produce, then I will command my blessing on you in the 6th year, and it will bring forth produce enough for 3 years. And you shall sow in the 8th year, and eat old produce until the 9th year. Until its produce comes in, you shall eat of the old harvest. So God's provision in the year of no planting was given, which was on a smaller scale had been true for the Sabbath day during the Exodus, as you can find back in Exodus chapter 16 verse 5. And when the important query was asked, God responded by promising that he would supply enough to last through that year. In verse 23, it says, The land shall not be sold permanently, for the land is mine, for you are strangers and sojourners of me. So, I like verse 23, because you can get theology out of it. And it says, the land shall not be sold permanently, for the land is mine, for you are strangers and sojourners with me. So, in verse 23, it reminds me of Psalm 24, verse 1, that says that God owns the earth and everything that's in it. And, God is sovereign over this universe, and we are literally ourselves strangers and sojourners that are passing through it. And the people of Israel were tenants of the land by the grace of God, because God had chosen them to give them this land. And the ownership of property was temporary, and they did not get to own property permanently. It was only temporary. In verse 24 through 28, And in all the land of your possession you shall grant redemption of the land. If one of your brethren comes poor and has sold some of his possession, and if his redeeming relative comes to redeem it, that he may redeem what his brother sold, or if the man has no one to redeem it, but he himself becomes able to redeem it, then let him count the years since its sale, and restore the remainder to the man to whom he sold it, that he may return to his possession. But if he is not able to have it restored to himself, then what was sold shall remain in the land of him who bought it until the year of Jubilee. And in the Jubilee it shall be released, and he shall return to his possession. So various regulations are gone over here in regards to real estate, and the redemption of the land was accompanied through the kinsman redeemer, who was a close relative, and they had the responsibility to buy the poor out of their poverty or their loss. And an example of a kinsman redeemer is in the book of Ruth. There was a kinsman redeemer in the book of Ruth. And if kinsman redeemer couldn't buy his brother out of debt, the land would return to the debtor during the year of Jubilee. In verse 29 through 34 says, if a man sells a house in a walled city, that he may redeem it within a whole year after it is sold. Within a full year he may redeem it. But if it is not redeemed within the space of a full year, then the house in the walled city shall be permanently to him who bought it. Throughout his generations it shall not be released in the Jubilee. However, the houses of the villages which have no wall around them shall be counted as the fields of the country. They may be redeemed, they shall be released in the Jubilee. Nevertheless, the cities of the Levites and the houses and the cities of their possession, the Levites may redeem at any time. And if a man purchases a house from the Levites, then the house was sold in the city of his possession, shall be released in the Jubilee. For the houses and the cities of the Levites are their possession among the children of Israel. But the field of the common land of their cities may not be sold, for it is their perpetual possession. So the laws of property described in the previous verses did not apply to urban real estate as they applied to rural, where one could make their livelihood. And only city properties, they were just a place to live, so property could be bought or sold more freely. And what we got to see here is the exception to the exception regarding urban real estate. And the property of the Levites would be theirs forever, redeemable at any time in the city or rural area. In verse 35 through 38, and if one of your brethren becomes poor and falls into poverty among you, then you shall help him like a stranger or a sojourner, that he may live with you. Take no usury or interest from him, but fear your God, that your brother may live with you. You shall not lend him your money for usury, or lend him your food at a profit. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God. So we see instructions here on how to deal with the poor outlined. And the law required gleanings for the Israelite as well as the stranger. In Psalm 15 verse 5, excessive interest was prohibited for all. So God was not a fan of interest against the poor. And that wasn't pay off the poor's debts and everything, but they should not have interest. And we see in America here that they want to get rid of student loan debt, and my thing is get rid of the interest. So my big thing against interest is actually a biblical concept. But even fair interest was otherwise prohibited in the dealing of the poor. And the basics of life were to be given, not loaned to the poor. And the Lord cited his generosity that God gave them the land of Canaan, and that wasn't theirs as a motive for their generosity toward the countrymen. So God, rubs it in, like, look how generous I was with you. Why can't you be generous with the poor here? In verse 39 through 46, and if one of your brothers who dwells with you, by you, becomes poor and sells himself to you, you should not compel him to serve as a slave. As a hired servant and a sojourner, he shall be with you, and you shall serve you until the year of Jubilee. And then he shall depart from you, he and his children with him, and shall return to his own family. He shall return to the possession of his fathers. For they are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves. You shall not rule over him with rigor, but you shall fear your God. And as for your male and female slaves, whom you may have from the nations that are around you, from them you may buy male and female slaves. Moreover, you may buy the children of the strangers who dwell among you, and their families who are with you, which they beget in your land. They shall become your property. So from here through the rest of this chapter, we look at the principles of downward slavery are laid out. And we know that the Mosaic law for Israel did allow slavery. They allowed a debtor to become a servant to pay off the debt. And they couldn't pay off by, and they had to work it off. And the law called for fairness and just and compassionate treatment for those who became slaves or servants to pay off a debt. It was not like the American slavery history or the African slave trade or any of that, where it was cruel and unusual punishment toward slaves, and they were pretty much kidnapped and trafficked. They would need to be released when the debt was paid, but also they were called to be released at the year of Jubilee. And foreign slaves among the Jews didn't have the same rights as the Hebrew slaves had, as they could be slaves for life. But God has still called even for the foreign slaves to be treated with humility, as stated in Exodus 20, verse 8 through 11. And slaves in this part of history in the Bible, Mosaic law, they were to be treated as family. They weren't to be treated as property. They weren't to be treated as dogs or, the lowest of the earth. They were to be treated with compassion and care. In verse 47 through the rest of the chapter 55, says, "Now if a sojourner or a stranger close to you becomes rich, and one of your brethren who dwells by him becomes poor and sells himself to the stranger or sojourner close to you, or to a member of the stranger's family, after he is sold, he may be redeemed again. One of his brothers may redeem him, or his uncle or his uncle's son may redeem him, or anyone who is near of kin to him and his family may redeem him. Or if he is able, he may redeem himself. Thus he shall be reckoned with him who bought him. The price of his release shall be according to the number of years from the year that he was sold to him until the year of Jubilee. It shall be according to the time of a hired servant for him. If there are still many years remaining, according to them he shall repay the price of the redemption from the money with which he was bought. And if there remain but a few years until the year of Jubilee, then he shall reckon with him, and according to his years he shall repay him the price of his redemption. He shall be with him as a yearly hired servant, and he shall not rule with rigor over him in your sight. And if he is not redeemed in these years, then he shall be released in the year of Jubilee, he and his children with him. For the children of Israel are servants to me. They are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God." So this is a very lengthy chapter. We're at 20 minutes almost, right before we're going to wrap up here shortly. But this section, it deals with those who were aliens, who had an Israelite slave. And as in redemption of land, the kinsman redeemer would buy the Hebrew slave out of servitude if he could, and the price was reckoned in relation to the year of Jubilee. And God cared so much about the matters, as each Israelite were to be a slave of the Lord. And God took them out of slavery in Egypt, and therefore they were to be treated as their own slaves with the same grace and the same generosity that God poured out for Israel. And to wrap up here, we looked at the special Sabbaths and the Jubilees within the land, and we look at the Sabbath and how to give in its Sabbath. We looked at the year of Jubilee that was to be observed every 50th year, and we saw how the land went back to its original family, and we saw God's provision for the Sabbath year as he promised Israel to provide for them if they obeyed him. And one key note that we should take as a bullet point in this video is that God provides for us too when we obey him. A keynote is God provides for us too if we obey him, even when it doesn't make sense. As we, as children of God in the new covenant, we need to trust God that he will provide for our needs, not our lusts, not our desires, not our idols that we want, but that God will provide for our basic needs. And let's look at what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 6, verse 33. So Matthew 6:33, it says, "But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added to you." And right before that verse, through verses like 19 through 32, Jesus is saying, don't worry about tomorrow. Don't worry what you'll eat. Don't worry about what you're going to wear. Don't worry about this. Don't worry about that. So Jesus, preaches to the Israelites on the Sermon on the Mount to not worry, that God will provide for their needs. But we must first seek the kingdom of God and his righteousness before these practical things will be granted to us. And we looked at the fundamental principle of the rules regarding the redemption of property. And God reminded Israel that they were only strangers and visitors to this earth, that this wasn't their permanent home. Even though that God was going to bring them into the promised land, that it wasn't for permanent, and that God had bigger plans. And as Christians, whether we live a good life here on earth or we live a life full of trials, this is not our home. We ourselves are strangers and all that. We're just passing through. This is not our permanent residence. And I want to look at 1 Peter chapter 2 in verse 11. It says, "Beloved, I beg you as sojourners and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lust, which war against the soul, having your conduct honorable among the Gentiles, that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may by your good works which they observe glorify God in the day of visitation." So the main verse I wanted to read there was verse 11. I beg you as sojourners and pilgrims. So as Christians, we are also just strangers and visitors. And this is not our home. Our permanent residence is heaven. And we look at the role of the kinsman redeemer. And who do you think in the new covenant is a picture for the kinsman redeemer? And if you said Jesus Christ, you are 100% correct on that. And Jesus is our kinsman redeemer as he purchased us from the slave market of sin. We were slaves to sin, and Jesus purchased us, as in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 20 tells us. And we saw the exception for urban real estate. We looked at lending and caring for the poor, to be compassionate to the poor and to consider the poor. And, one big thing in the Christian faith is we are taught that we should help others without expecting back. And, it should be a blessing to you to want to give to others and help others out. And just a few days ago, what's today, Thursday? So 2 days ago was Given Tuesday, which is, a day that's set apart for the year for people to give to different charities or causes and all that. But, as Christians, we need to be generous every day. We need to be generous and bless people every day, and not just the one time a year. Or, we don't need to live off the American calendar and observe, thankfulness one day a year, observe generosity one day of the year, and all that stuff. As Christians, these things should be our lifestyle. And I want to look at Luke chapter 6, verse 34. It says here, "And if you lend to those from whom you hope to receive back, what credit is that to you? For even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much back." So Jesus made a similar command here outside of the book of Leviticus. And Jesus says, you're going to give to others. Why do you expect back? The world outside the church, a lot of people will give, and expect back. It's very seldom in human nature to want to give and bless others and not expect anything back, doing it out of love. And we looked at when a Hebrew became a slave because of debt. And, we look at the chapter ended with redeeming a Hebrew slave from a foreigner in the process of that. And I'm going to wrap up right here. We're at 27 minutes, and I'm going to be back, I think, tomorrow night or Saturday. So we'll be looking next at the blessings and cursing of obedience and disobedience. So we'll actually be back here on Saturday to go through chapter 26. And we're going to knock out chapter 27 on Sunday. So have a great rest of your night. God bless, and have a good weekend that's coming up.